Every man, overvaluing his own worth, would be a commander. William Strachey, 1610. When William Strachey wrote those words, he was trying to explain to an English audience what had gone wrong the year before, when the mighty Sea Venture, the newly minted flagship of a fleet sent by the Virginia Company in London, had gotten sidetracked on the way to Virginia and had crash-landed in the Devil's Isles, also known as Bermuda. The tempest that scattered the fleet and wrecked the Sea Venture was most likely a hurricane that occurred in the summer of 1609. All 150 settlers on the Sea Venture survived, but there was another storm when they got to shore, a political storm, which inspired Shakespeare to write a comedy, for he saw humor in the idea of common people rising up against their social betters. But the real-life American Stephano was the settler known as Stephen Hopkins, a bit of a jailhouse lawyer, who will cause trouble not only in Bermuda, but also in 1620 while aboard the Mayflower, and he will sign the Mayflower Compact. Here is his saga. While very little is known about the life of Stephen Hopkins before his adventure in America, records indicate he was baptized in 1581 and grew up in the county of Hampshire along the English Channel in and around the town of Winchester. Hopkins had some education, as it is known that he assisted the local parish priest in reading the Psalms and passages from the Bible. He was of a lower middling family and already had a wife and several children before financial hardship caused him to leave them behind in England while he made his fortune in the New World. He signed up for the 1609 voyage on board the Sea Venture.
So what was the Sea Venture? Well, she was a purpose-built ship, the pride and joy of the Virginia Company of London, the flagship of a fleet of 7 ships that would tow 2 pinnaces and contain hundreds of colonists, men, women, and children, to resupply the struggling colony at Jamestown, Virginia. The Sea Venture, as an immigrant ship, had all of her cannon on the main deck to give more room for the colonists down below, and she could carry 300 tons of cargo. But there was one major problem. The Sea Venture was so new, her timbers had not fully set. This would prove to be a big problem in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean several months later.
So what was Stephen Hopkins doing on board the Sea Venture? As a flagship, she would have been reserved for the highest-ranking settlers and the leaders of the colony. Well, Hopkins had signed on to become the minister's clerk at Jamestown to assist the new Reverend Richard Buck in reading the Psalms and passages from the Bible. It's the same job he performed back home in Hampshire. And since Reverend Buck was aboard the Sea Venture, Hopkins would be on the Sea Venture with him. And Reverend Buck's friendship and patronage would prove very valuable to Stephen Hopkins several weeks later when they had crash-landed in Bermuda. Most of what we know about the voyage of the Sea Venture comes from the writings of William Strachey, who was on board. The fleet was taking a shortcut across the Atlantic Ocean to save time and to avoid detection by the Spanish. For the first few weeks, it was a very uneventful journey, as the Sea Venture and the rest of the fleet enjoyed pleasant weather. By July 24th, the skies began to grow darker, the waves began to rise, and a tempest was brewing. The hurricane had scattered the fleet, and the 2 pinnaces were cut loose, and the Sea Venture, whose timbers were not quite set, began to lose her caulking and spring leaks. As the storm raged on, the passengers and crew, no matter what their social class, began to work furiously to bail out the water. But after 5 days, arms, legs, and backs grew tired, while the water in the hold of the ship grew to be 6 feet deep. The Sea Venture could take no more. As Captain Christopher Newport rallied the crew, the admiral of the fleet, Sir George Somers, took the helm and spotted land and crash-landed the Sea Venture by wedging it between the shoals off the rocky coast of the Devil's Isles, also known as Bermuda. The admiral's actions saved the lives of all 150 passengers, including the dog, and these settlers would be marooned in Bermuda for the next 8 months. So who was in charge of these Maroons in Bermuda? Was it the Admiral, Sir George Somers, since they had not completed their sea journey? or because they were now on land, was it the governor, Sir Thomas Gates? Both men understood that the best thing to do was to follow orders and to get these settlers to Virginia as quick as possible by building ships out of the wreckage and local wood. But who was giving the orders? Was it the sailors or the soldiers? And if the leadership was divided, what did this mean to the regular settlers who had crash landed? Trouble began in Bermuda almost immediately. It was a nice place to crash land. The weather was temperate, there were wild berries and plentiful fish. The Spanish sailors had left behind wild hogs. Even the cowbirds, whose shrieks gave Bermuda its nickname, the Devil's Isles, turned out to be rather docile and harmless, and they were easy to catch. The settlers began to live in the state of nature. And as a longboat was sent out to reach Jamestown in September and never returned, and all the sailors on it were lost, many of the settlers began to see it as a sign that God wanted them to stay in Bermuda and not go to Virginia.
William Strachey, who was staunchly loyal to Sir Thomas Gates, wrote about the murmurs and discontent coming from the common settlers against the absolute authority of the governor. The first was a group of 6 men who rebelled, that Strachey described as being led by a Brownist, a separatist, a radical, a member of the religious sect that the Pilgrims came from. But they were easily dismissed and even forgiven. But the second attempt came from someone a little better educated.
Strachey referred to Stephen Hopkins as, quote, a fellow who had much knowledge in the scriptures and could reason well therein, unquote. And perhaps that was Strachey's biggest problem. Stephen Hopkins knew how to reason. Stephen Hopkins began to complain to his fellow colonists that the leadership of Sir Thomas Gates was ungodly because God had saved the Sea Venture. God had placed them in Bermuda. God had provided them with food, and therefore the settlers should be able to leave at their own pleasures. Well, one of Hopkins' confederates sold him out, and Stephen was arrested and brought before the whole company in manacles. Sir Thomas Gates erected a gallows, and Stephen Hopkins was brought to trial. Hopkins pled simplicity and denial, that he was misled, that his own wife and children would be ruined if he were to be executed, and he cried out and begged forgiveness. William Strachey wrote that the leading settlers began to ask the governor for a pardon, including Reverend Richard Buck and Strachey himself. Therefore, Stephen Hopkins would not be executed in Bermuda, and by all accounts and purposes, became a well-behaved settler for the rest of his stay. Perhaps William Strachey wrote about the story of Stephen Hopkins to remind the people of England of what happened when Englishmen were left in the wilderness, when they didn't follow their proper, godly ordained leadership, when they began to interpret Scripture for themselves, and chaos ensued, or what they called at the time innovation, which in the 17th century was considered an insulting word. But by May 24th, the pinnaces had been built, named Patience and Deliverance, and the people of Bermuda made it to Jamestown, Virginia, only to find that the settlers at Jamestown were nearly all wiped out from the starving time winter, when they had been reduced to eating dogs, cats, venomous snakes, horses, and even each other. Sir Thomas Gates began to feed the starving colonists at Jamestown, but after a few weeks it was determined there was not much else to do but to abandon the colony. By June, they had gotten a few miles down the James River before they were turned around by another fleet led by Lord Delaware, a new governor. The settlers were returned to James Fort. They buried their garbage, rebuilt the buildings, and began a war against the Powhatan that would lead to the capture of Pocahontas, the marriage of Rolfe and Pocahontas, the development of tobacco, and the second chapter of the story of Jamestown. We don't know Stephen Hopkins' thoughts about all of this, but we know he kept rather quiet and lived in Virginia for a few years. But he got word that his wife had died, and he had to return to England to take care of his children, and he will never see Virginia again. As for William Strachey, the frustrated playwright, whose story of the Sea Venture actually inspired Shakespeare to take the idea and write The Tempest, he would go on to write The Laws Divine, Moral, and Martial, a set of draconian codes that Jamestown was governed by until 1619, the very rules that Stephen Hopkins and the other settlers in Bermuda chafed under. As for Stephen Hopkins, he will return to America, but in 1620 on board the Mayflower. Hopkins had married again and brought his wife and children with him. He was part of the group of passengers known as the Strangers, for they were not a part of the original core pilgrim group who had stayed together in Holland. The Mayflower pilgrims were intending to settle the then northern part of Virginia, what is now the New York City area. But off the coast of Cape Cod, they faced stormy weather and rough seas, and were having difficulty sailing farther south. So Stephen Hopkins yet again found himself on a passenger ship in rough seas, and he began to lead another rebellion.
So how did the Pilgrims respond to this mutiny led by the Strangers who wanted to use their own liberty? Rather than hang Hopkins and the others, they created a social contract, an agreement based on majoritarian principles of government and allegiance to the king. It was known as the Mayflower Compact, a civil covenant that will be very important in the history of Massachusetts, and one of the signers of that document was Stephen Hopkins.
Despite the inauspicious beginning, Stephen Hopkins would find a home in Plymouth, Massachusetts. For one thing, his time in Virginia proved quite useful to the Pilgrims, as his knowledge of Native American folkways and trade became quite useful. He became a leading town figure. His daughter Constance was actually a key figure in the Thanksgiving story, and Hopkins later operated a tavern. But he still got in trouble. Towards the end of his life, Hopkins was accused of selling alcohol on the Sabbath and allowing games of cards and chance. Nevertheless, Stephen Hopkins, who had many descendants, a man who survived the Sea Venture shipwreck, who lived through Virginia and became a key figure in Massachusetts, is a key figure that bridged Jamestown and Plymouth. And he was also my 11th time great-grandfather. Thanks for watching.